power isn't just about having a seat at the table. It's about what happens when someone tries to take that seat away from you. For Serafina James, a titan of the tech world, that seat was 1A in first class. She had earned it, paid for it, and it was hers. But on a cold Tuesday morning, the flight crew of Oceanic Air Flight 815 saw only the color of her skin, not the color of her ticket. They made the biggest mistake of their lives. In 5 minutes, she would own their jobs. But in the weeks that followed, the true cost of her power would unravel in a storm of public opinion, corporate betrayal, and a brutal twist of fate that no one, least of all her, saw coming. This isn't just a story of revenge. It's a cautionary tale of how quickly the victor can become the victim. The air in the private Onyx lounge at JFK was a sterile, climate-controlled hum, a stark contrast to the chaotic symphony of announcements and rolling suitcases in the main terminal. It smelled of expensive leather and faint, citrusy air freshener. Serafina James, founder and CEO of Aura Innovations, didn't notice. She was staring at a line of code on her tablet, her brow furrowed in concentration. To anyone watching, she might have looked out of place. She wasn't in a power suit. She wore custom-tailored Loro Piana cashmere joggers, a simple black silk top, and a pair of Virgil Abloh-designed off-white sneakers that cost more than most people's rent. It was the uniform of someone so wealthy they no longer needed to dress to impress. Her phone buzzed. It was her COO, Michael. "The final papers are ready to be wired, Sarah. The Global Wings Alliance Board is expecting the transfer by EOD tomorrow. You sure you don't want to fly private for this?" Serafina swiped to dismiss the call, texting back a curt, "Commercial is fine. Need to see the customer experience firsthand. This is reconnaissance." She had been working for 2 years on this move. Global Wings Alliance was a behemoth aviation conglomerate that owned 3 airlines, including the struggling Oceanic Air. It was a legacy company, bloated and inefficient. Aura Innovations, a leader in AI logistics and sustainable energy solutions, was about to execute the final stage of a hostile takeover. She wasn't just buying a company. She was buying an empire to revolutionize. This flight from New York to San Francisco was a final anonymous audit of her new acquisition's crown jewel airline. An attendant called the flight. "We now invite our first-class passengers to begin boarding, Flight 815, to San Francisco at Gate B42. Serafina packed her tablet into her Hermes carry-on, slung it over her shoulder, and walked towards the gate. The priority lane was short. She handed her phone, displaying the digital boarding pass for seat 1A, to the gate agent, a harried-looking man named Gary Phillips, whose name tag was slightly askew. Gary scanned it. The machine beeped green. He looked at the screen, then at Serafina, then back at the screen. A flicker of something confusion-suspicion crossed his face. "There might be an issue here, Mom," he said, his tone flat. "An issue?" Serafina asked, her voice calm. It scanned green, seat 1A. "Yes, I see that," Gary said, tapping at his keyboard. "But the system is flagging a potential duplicate booking for this seat. Can I see your identification, please?" Serafina produced her driver's license. He studied it. "Serafina James." He mumbled the name as if tasting an unfamiliar word. "And this ticket was booked through your company's travel portal." "It was booked by my executive assistant, yes," she replied, a sliver of impatience entering her voice. The regular boarding line was beginning to swell behind her. "Well, there's another passenger here, a Mr. Henderson, who is also assigned to 1A. He's one of our Platinum Elite members," Gary said, gesturing vaguely towards a portly man in a rumpled suit standing nearby, looking impatient. "There's likely been a system glitch. I can put you in a premium economy seat, 12B, and we can sort out the refund for the fare difference later." He spoke with an air of finality. as if he'd just solved a complex puzzle, and she should be grateful. He wasn't offering a solution, he was delivering a verdict. Serafina's calm demeanor hardened just a fraction. "That's not a solution. I booked and paid for seat 1A. It's a fully confirmed ticket. There is no fare difference to sort out. I want the seat I purchased." "Ma'am." Gary sighed, the manufactured patience wearing thin. "I have a full flight here. I don't have time to debate this. The system gives priority to our elite status members in cases of a duplicate booking. It's policy." He avoided her eyes, focusing instead on his monitor. It was a lie, and they both knew it. A confirmed first-class ticket trumped any status-based claim in a rare double-booking scenario. The truth was hanging unspoken in the air between them. Mr. Henderson was a white man in a suit who looked like he belonged. Serafina, a black woman in high-end streetwear, apparently did not. Gary had made a snap judgment, an assessment of who was more likely to be in the right place, and he was now contorting policy to fit his prejudice. "Get your supervisor," Serafina said. Her voice was no longer patient. It was cold steel. "Our supervisor is handling a customs issue on another flight. I can offer you 12B, or I can book you on the next flight out, which is in 4 hours. Please make a decision. You're holding up the line." He began to reach for her phone to change the seat assignment himself. Serafina pulled her phone back. A small crowd was now watching. She could feel their eyes on her. She saw the mix of pity, annoyance, and judgment. She locked eyes with Gary. "You're making a significant error in judgment, Gary," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Let me on the plane. Let me speak to the purser. We can handle it there." Gary, flustered and emboldened by the audience, shook his head. "I can't let you board with a contested ticket for that cabin. Take the other seat or wait for the next flight." Serafina gave a single sharp nod. "Fine." She stepped out of the line, her face an unreadable mask of composure. Mr. Henderson shot her a smug look and sauntered down the jet bridge. Serafina watched him go, then took out her phone again. She didn't call customer service. She dialed a number from her favorites. The voice on the other end answered instantly. "Yes, Miss James." "William," she said, her voice low and steady. "I need you to get Richard Davenport on the line. Now, tell him the CEO of his soon-to-be parent company is being denied boarding on Oceanic Air Flight 815 by his gate agent." A few minutes later, after a panicked call from a supervisor who had suddenly materialized out of thin air, Gary Phillips, now pale and sweating profusely, apologized and scanned Serafina's ticket again. "My sincerest apologies, Ms. James. A system error. All sorted now. Please enjoy your flight." Serafina didn't give him the satisfaction of a response. She walked down the jet bridge, the forced politeness of the ground crew echoing behind her. As she stepped into the cabin, she was met by the lead flight attendant, a woman in her late 50s, with perfectly coiffed blonde hair and a name badge that read Brenda Hoskins. Her smile was a strained, painted-on crescent. "Welcome aboard," Brenda chirped, her eyes glancing at Serafina's boarding pass, and then doing a subtle but unmistakable top-to-bottom scan of her attire. The smile tightened. 1A, Serafina said, moving past her into the hushed enclave of the first-class cabin. She found Mr. Henderson already comfortably settled in her seat, his jacket off a glass of orange juice in his hand. He looked up, his face a mixture of surprise and irritation. Brenda Hoskins followed close behind. "Ah," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I see we have a bit of a mix-up." "There's no mix-up," Serafina stated calmly, placing her bag in the overhead bin above 1B. "This gentleman is in my seat." Brenda turned to Mr. Henderson. "Sir, I'm so sorry, but it seems there's been a slight issue with your seat assignment." Then she turned back to Serafina. "Ma'am, perhaps we can find you another comfortable seat while we sort this out." She gestured vaguely toward the back of the small first-class cabin, where a middle seat in the second row was still empty. "I don't want another comfortable seat," Serafina said, her gaze unwavering. "I want my seat. 1A. The cabin was quiet now. The other first-class passengers were trying very hard not to stare, hiding behind newspapers and pretending to be absorbed in their phones. Mr. Henderson huffed, clearly annoyed at being the center of the drama. "Look, the gate agent told me this was my seat. I'm a Platinum Elite flyer. I fly this route every week." Brenda placed a placating hand on his arm. "Of course you are, Mr. Henderson. We value your loyalty immensely." She then turned her full attention to Serafina, her professional veneer cracking to reveal a stern, school-marmish disapproval. "Ma'am, we are trying to resolve this. We have a full flight and we need to depart on time. Causing a scene isn't going to help." The accusation hung in the air. Causing a scene. It was a classic deflection, a way to frame the victim of an error as the source of the problem. "The only person causing a scene, Brenda Serafina, said reading her name tag with pointed deliberation, is you by refusing to honor a valid ticket. The gate agent made an error. Now you're perpetuating it. Please ask this man to move to his assigned seat or find him another one. I'll be taking mine." Brenda's face flushed a blotchy red. She saw a problem, and her mind, conditioned by years of unspoken biases, had already decided who was in the wrong. She saw a frequent flying businessman versus a woman who, in her eyes, didn't fit the first-class mold. She leaned in her voice, dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Listen, I don't know how you got this ticket," she hissed, the politeness completely gone. "But I am the purser on this flight, and I will not have my elite passengers harassed. I'm going to have to ask you to take the seat I offered in row 12, or I will call the captain, and we'll have you removed from the aircraft for being disruptive." It was the final straw. The threat, the condescension, the outright refusal to even consider that she, Serafina James, belonged there. This wasn't just poor customer service. This was a deep-seated institutional rot, a culture that allowed employees like Gary and Brenda to operate with impunity, making judgments based on prejudice rather than facts. This was the customer experience she had come to witness, and it was rotten to the core. Serafina's expression became eerily calm. The fire in her eyes was replaced by a glacier. She took a small step back, creating space. "You want to call the captain?" she asked, her voice soft, but carrying through the silent cabin. "Please do. Get him out here right now, and while you're at it, you might want to call your union representative." Brenda scoffed. "I don't need my union rep to deal with someone like you." "Oh, I think you will," Serafina said. She pulled out her phone. She didn't make a call. She simply opened her email and forwarded a single message to her lawyer, her COO, and a special acquisitions team she had on standby. The subject line was one word: execute. She looked up at Brenda, whose face was a mask of smug defiance. She looked at the other passengers who were now staring openly. She looked at Mr. Henderson, who was smirking into his orange juice. 5 minutes, Serafina said to Brenda, her voice resonating with an authority that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. In 5 minutes, the chain of command you report to is going to change. And your career, along with the careers of Gary Phillips at Gate B4U and the captain of this aircraft, if he doesn't rectify this, immediately will be over. Brenda laughed, a short, sharp, disbelieving sound. You're delusional. Serafina simply smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a queen who had just checkmated a pawn. The transfer for the controlling stake in Global Wings Alliance was just wired. As of 3 minutes ago, my company Aura Innovations is the majority shareholder. Which means, as of 3 minutes ago, I own this airline, and I own your job. The silence in the first-class cabin was absolute. It was so profound that the faint whine of the auxiliary power unit from outside sounded like a roar. Brenda Hoskins' condescending smirk evaporated, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of pure, unadulterated shock. The color drained from her face, leaving her blotchy skin a sickly, pale grey. Mr. Henderson, who had been enjoying the show, slowly lowered his glass of orange juice, the smirk wiped clean from his face. You're lying," Brenda stammered, but her voice lacked conviction. The sheer, unshakable confidence radiating from Serafina was terrifying. It was the kind of confidence that didn't need to bluster or shout. It was a simple statement of fact. Serafina's phone buzzed. She glanced at it. "That will be the captain," she said almost conversationally. As if on cue, the cockpit door opened and Captain Robert Miller emerged. He was tall with silver hair and an air of weary authority. He looked from Brenda to Serafina, his expression one of annoyance at being pulled from his pre-flight checks. "Brenda, what's the issue here? We're already 10 minutes behind schedule." "Captain," Brenda began, her voice trembling slightly. This passenger is refusing to take an assigned seat and is making threats." Captain Miller turned his stern gaze on Serafina. "Ma'am, I am the captain of this aircraft. My purser's instructions are to be followed without argument. If you are being disruptive, I will have you removed." Serafina didn't even flinch. She met his gaze. "Captain Miller," she said, her tone level and precise. "Before you say another word, I recommend you check the corporate comms from Global Wings Alliance headquarters. There should be an urgent all-hands notification pushed to your company device within the next 60 seconds. I suggest you read it." The captain's brow furrowed. This was not the typical response from an unruly passenger. There was no hysteria, no shouting, just cold, calm instruction. He looked at Brenda, whose face was now a pleading mask of panic, and then back at Serafina. Something in her eyes, a deep, unassailable certainty, made him pause. He pulled out his company-issued tablet. As he unlocked it, a notification banner flashed across the top of the screen. "Urgent corporate governance announcement." He tapped it. His eyes scanned the first few lines. His posture changed instantly. The authoritative stiffness in his shoulders slumped. The color faded from his own cheeks. He read the memo, his eyes widening in disbelief, then reread it, as if trying to will the words into changing. The memo announced the successful completion of a majority acquisition by Aura Innovations. It named Serafina James as the new chairwoman of the Oversight Committee for the entire Global Wings Alliance, effective immediately. Her authority superseded the existing board on all operational matters until a new CEO was appointed. He looked up from the tablet, his face a portrait of dawning horror. He was no longer looking at a disruptive passenger. He was looking at his new boss, the ultimate boss. "Ms. James," he said, his voice now deferential, laced with dread. I apologize. There seems to have been a catastrophic misunderstanding." "There has been no misunderstanding, Captain," Serafina replied, her voice cutting through the tension. "There has been a demonstration of a profoundly broken corporate culture, one of prejudice, incompetence, and disrespect. And it stops now, starting with your crew." She looked past him, her eyes locking onto Brenda, who looked as if she might collapse. "Brenda Hoskins." Serafina said the name, sounding like a verdict. Your employment with Oceanic Air and any subsidiary of the Global Wings Alliance is terminated effective immediately. You will gather your personal belongings and deplane." Brenda gasped, a hand flying to her mouth. "You can't do that." "I can and I have," Serafina stated. "Captain, see that she does." She then turned her gaze to the cockpit. "The same applies to your first officer, who I can only assume was complicit in your decision to ignore a legitimate complaint in your cabin. Your own employment is under review, pending a full investigation into your failure to command. For now, you will find a new purser and first officer from the standby crew. You will not take off until you do so." Her eyes then landed on Mr. Henderson, who seemed to be trying to shrink into the luxurious upholstery of seat 1A. "As for you, sir," she said, "get out of my seat." Mr. Henderson scrambled to his feet so fast he nearly tripped, grabbing his jacket and practically fleeing the first-class cabin without a word. Serafina turned back to the shell-shocked Captain Miller. "One more thing. I need the full name and employee ID of the gate agent at B-42. His name is Gary Phillips. His termination is also effective immediately." The captain just nodded numbly. The power dynamic had shifted so completely and so rapidly it was like a law of physics had been inverted. A few moments ago, he was the master of this small metal kingdom. Now he was taking orders from a woman he had been ready to eject. Brenda, tears now streaming down her face, began to plead. "Please, Miss James. I have a family. I've been with this airline for 30 years. It was a mistake." "It wasn't a mistake," Serafina said, her voice devoid of any sympathy. "A mistake is entering the wrong meal order. What you did was a choice. You looked at me, and you made a judgment based on a prejudice you probably don't even have the courage to admit to yourself. You wielded your tiny bit of power to humiliate a customer you deemed less than. You are the face of the rot I'm here to cut out. Now please, leave my plane." The finality in her voice was absolute. Captain Miller, looking utterly defeated, gently took a crying Brenda by the arm and escorted her towards the galley. The quiet hum of the cabin returned now, thick with the palpable shock of what everyone had just witnessed. Serafina James calmly took her seat in 1A, placed her tablet on the console, and looked out the window as if nothing had happened. The new era of Oceanic Air had begun. The flight to San Francisco eventually took off. 2 hours delayed, with a new, visibly nervous crew who treated Serafina with the kind of cautious reverence usually reserved for royalty or deities. They offered her anything and everything: vintage champagne, a 5-course meal, a cashmere blanket still in its plastic wrapping. She accepted only a bottle of water. She spent the entire flight working her face, illuminated by the glow of her tablet, a fortress of silent, focused intensity. The cold satisfaction of her victory was a fleeting, hollow thing. Justice had been served swiftly and decisively, but as the plane descended into SFO, a different kind of storm was gathering on the ground. By the time she was in the back of her chauffeured car, her phone was vibrating uncontrollably. A text from her head of PR, a sharp woman named Chloe, was at the top. "Urgent. We have a situation. Go dark. Don't post anything. Call me ASAP." Serafina called. "What is it, Chloe?" "It's the flight attendant, Brenda Hoskins." Chloe said, her voice tense. Her daughter is a social media influencer, a mommy blogger type, 500,000 followers. She just posted a video. A selfie video, of her mother crying right after she got off the plane. It's bad, Sarah. It's very, very bad. Chloe sent her the link. Serafina clicked it. The video was shaky shot in a coffee shop at JFK. Brenda Hoskins was there, her face tear-streaked and puffy, her uniform jacket gone. Her daughter, a blonde woman in her 30s, named Tiffany, held the camera, her own face, a mask of furious indignation. "I can't believe I have to make this video," Tiffany began, her voice cracking with emotion. "My mum, Brenda, has been a loyal flight attendant for Oceanic Air for 30 years. 30 years today, she was fired, on the spot, humiliated in front of an entire plane of passengers by a power-tripping, arrogant CEO, Serafina James." The video cut to Brenda, who sobbed into a napkin. "She just looked at me with such hate, all because of a simple seating mix-up. I was just trying to do my job to keep the flight on schedule, and she destroyed my life. 30 years of service, gone. This woman, this CEO," Tiffany continued, her voice dripping with venom, "decided to make an example of my mum. She didn't just fire her, she fired the whole crew, the gate agent, the pilots. For what? For a seat. My mum has a mortgage. My dad is sick. This job was their lifeline, and this billionaire Serafina James took it all away with a snap of her fingers because her ego was bruised. The video was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. It conveniently omitted any mention of the racial profiling, the condescension, the threats to have Serafina removed. It painted Brenda as a dedicated working-class victim, and Serafina as a monstrous, out-of-touch corporate villain, an ice queen CEO from hell. The hashtags were already trending. Yash boycott Aura, Kasha justice for Brenda, Najash corporate bully. "The narrative is set," Chloe said grimly over the phone. "They framed it as a powerful billionaire punching down on a working mother. It's a perfect David and Goliath story for the social media age. We're getting slaughtered in the comments." Serafina scrolled through them. "See, this is what's wrong with the world. The rich get richer and treat everyone else like dirt. I don't care what happened. Firing someone's mum like that is pure evil. Her dad is sick, heartless. Aura Innovations, is this who you are? A company run by a monster. Sash, cancel Aura." Her own story, the truth of what had happened, was irrelevant. The court of public opinion had already passed its sentence. The nuance of the situation, the quiet, insidious racism that had sparked the whole incident, was buried under a tidal wave of populist rage. They hadn't seen Brenda's sneer, heard Gary's dismissive tone, or felt the sting of being treated like an intruder in a space you rightfully occupy. They only saw a crying woman and a powerful black CEO who had fired her. "We need to release a statement," Serafina said, her voice tight. "Explain what happened. The prejudice, the refusal to honor the ticket. We can," Chloe said, "but we'll be fighting an uphill battle. Right now, we're the Goliath. No one wants to hear Goliath's side of the story. They want to see him fall." The car pulled up to the San Francisco office of Aura Innovations. The building, a sleek marvel of glass and steel, usually filled her with a sense of pride. Tonight, it felt like a target. As she got out of the car, she saw a news van already parked across the street. The feeding frenzy had begun. Inside, her executive floor was in a state of controlled chaos. The board of Global Wings Alliance was demanding a meeting. Her own board at Aura was panicking. The stock in after-hours trading was already showing signs of a dip. In a few short hours, her decisive act of justice had been twisted into an act of petty tyranny. She had asserted her power to right a wrong, but in doing so, she had handed her enemies the perfect weapon to use against her. The satisfaction she had felt on the plane was now a bitter ash in her mouth. She had won the battle on Flight 815, but she was quickly realizing she was on the verge of losing a much larger war. The next 48 hours were a blur of crisis management. The story exploded from social media into the mainstream. Cable news channels ran segments with solemn-faced pundits debating the ethics of corporate power. Newspapers published op-eds with headlines like, "The Tyranny of the New Tech Elite." Serafina James was no longer a celebrated innovator. She was a caricature, a modern-day Marie Antoinette firing the little people from her ivory tower. The board of the Global Wings Alliance, who had been licking their wounds after the hostile takeover, saw their chance. The acting chairman, a shrewd old guard executive named Harrison Croft, requested an emergency video conference. Serafina sat at the head of her vast mahogany conference table, her face projected onto a massive screen where a dozen other faces stared back at her, a gallery of grim, disapproving portraits. Chloe sat beside her tablet, in hand, feeding her real-time analytics. "Ms. James Swab." Harrison began, his voice smooth and laced with faux concern. "This situation is deeply troubling. The public perception is catastrophic. Oceanic Air's brand is taking a significant hit. Customers are cancelling flights. The pilots' union is threatening to strike in solidarity. This is not the smooth transition we had envisioned. The transition is a process of removing inefficiencies and cultural rot." "Harrison," Serafina retorted, her voice firm. "What happened on that flight was a symptom of a disease that has been poisoning your company for years. I simply administered the first dose of medicine. You fired an entire flight crew on a whim," another board member, a woman named Beatrice, chimed in. "Without due process, without HR involvement. It was a reckless abuse of authority." "Was it reckless to be denied my paid-for seat?" Serafina shot back. "Was it an abuse of authority when your purser threatened to have me removed from a plane I now own because she didn't like the look of me? Do not lecture me on recklessness. My actions were a direct consequence of the actions of your employees." But her logic was bouncing off a wall of calculated resistance. They didn't care about the why. They only cared about the fallout. "The market doesn't care about the why, Serafina," Harrison said, leaning into his camera. "It cares about stability. It cares about optics. And right now, the optics are that the new ownership is impulsive, vindictive, and hostile to labor. Our stock has dropped 7% in 2 days. Your own company's stock is down 4%. This isn't just about Oceanic Air anymore. You've made yourself the story, and it's hurting both companies." The conversation went in circles for an hour. They demanded she issue a public apology to Brenda Hoskins and reinstate the crew. Serafina refused. It would be an admission of wrongdoing, a betrayal of the very principle she had fought for. She would not apologize for refusing to tolerate prejudice. The meeting ended in a stalemate, the tension thicker than ever. But the real betrayal was yet to come. Later that evening, she received a call from a private number. It was David Chen, her mentor, a legendary venture capitalist who had given Serafina her first seed money when Aura Innovations was just an idea sketched on a napkin. He was on the board of several tech giants and was the moral compass of Silicon Valley for many. "Sarah," he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "We need to talk." "David, I assume you've seen the news," she said, a wave of weariness washing over her. "I have, and I've read your internal statement. I believe your version of events. But that's not what I called about," he said. "I called to talk about the how. You had 1,000 ways to handle that situation, Sarah. You could have documented everything, taken it to the board, and forced a change in policy and training from the top down. You could have made it a teachable moment for the entire industry. They needed to see there are immediate consequences, David," she argued. "A memo about new training protocols doesn't undo the humiliation of being treated like a criminal for existing in a space you've earned." "And what about the consequences you're facing now?" he countered. "You didn't just fire a flight attendant. You created a martyr. You handed a weapon to every person who wants to see you fail. Power isn't about the nuclear option, Sarah. It's about having the wisdom not to use it. You built Aura to innovate, to solve problems with intelligence and elegance. What you did on that plane, that was blunt force. It wasn't you. His words hit her harder than any of the board members' accusations. David's disappointment felt like a physical blow. The consortium of investors I lead, we have a significant stake in Aura. He continued, and Serafina felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. Our confidence is shaken, not in your vision, but in your temperament as a leader. This impulsiveness creates risk, unnecessary risk. It wasn't a threat, but it was a clear and terrifying warning. David Chen commanded billions in investment capital. If he pulled his support, other investors would follow. Her own company, the empire she had built from nothing, was now on shaky ground because of a 5-minute confrontation at 30,000 feet. She ended the call, the silence of her office pressing in on her. The public hated her. Her new company was in rebellion, and now her oldest allies were beginning to doubt her. For the first time, she felt a sliver of fear. She had been so certain of the righteousness of her actions, so focused on the principle. She had never stopped to consider that in the complex game of power and perception, being right was not always the same as winning. The hard karma, when it came, was not a single thunderclap, but a series of devastating, interconnected lightning strikes. It began with a journalist. Amelia Hayes was a Pulitzer-nominated investigative reporter for the New York Times, known for her deeply researched, human-focused pieces. She wasn't interested in the screaming headlines or the Twitter outrage. She was interested in the story behind the story. For a week, she was silent. Then her article dropped, and it detonated on the front page. The headline was simple: "The flight attendant, the CEO and the husband in room 302. Amelia Hayes hadn't just interviewed a crying Brenda Hoskins. She had dug into her life. She found public records, spoke to neighbors, and visited a quiet, beige-colored hospice care facility in suburban New Jersey. The article opened with a heart-wrenching description of Frank Hoskins, Brenda's husband, of 35 years. He was in the final stages of a brutal fight with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS. The article detailed their financial struggles. Frank's illness had exhausted their life savings. Brenda had taken every extra shift she could get, her sole focus on keeping her job, because the Global Wings Alliance health insurance policy was the only thing paying for his round-the-clock palliative care. It was a gold-plated, union-negotiated plan that was almost impossible to find elsewhere. Her job wasn't just a job, it was her husband's lifeline. The piece was masterfully written. It didn't excuse Brenda's actions on the plane. In a single damning paragraph, Hayes quoted an anonymous fellow flight attendant who described Brenda's old-school attitude and her tendency to be judgmental of passengers who didn't fit a certain look. But the article framed that fatal flaw not as the central issue, but as a tragic catalyst. The narrative it wove was devastating. A stressed, terrified woman, worn down by her husband's impending death, made a terrible, prejudiced mistake. And for that mistake, a billionaire CEO didn't just take her job, she effectively signed a death warrant for her husband's care. The public reaction was immediate and volcanic. The last vestiges of support for Serafina vanished. She was no longer just a corporate bully. She was a monster of biblical cruelty. The hashtag #Justice for Brenda was replaced by #Save Frank Hoskins. A GoFundMe for the Hoskins family, started by their daughter Tiffany, exploded, raising over $1 million in 24 hours. The business consequences were swift. The pilots' union announced a one-day sick-out in protest, grounding hundreds of oceanic air flights and costing the company millions. The Global Wings Alliance board, led by Harrison Croft, saw their ultimate opportunity. They called an emergency shareholder meeting, citing a crisis of leadership and invoking a key person risk clause in the acquisition agreement. Their motion to strip Serafina James of her operational authority as chairwoman of the Oversight Committee. Simultaneously, the fallout hit Aura Innovations. David Chen made his move. In a public letter to the board, his investment consortium formally expressed its lack of confidence in her leadership and requested the board consider appointing an interim CEO to stabilize the company and its public image. It was a brutal public shiv. Serafina found herself fighting a war on two fronts. She was trapped in board meetings from dawn until midnight. The arguments were the same, but now her opponents were armed with the story of Frank Hoskins. This is no longer about a seating dispute, Serafina Harrison Croft thundered during one heated exchange. This is about a fundamental lack of humanity. You have made our company radioactive. In her own company, the betrayal was quieter but deeper. Board members she had hand-picked people who had gotten rich off her vision now refused to meet her eye. They spoke in platitudes about shareholder value and fiduciary duty. But the message was clear: she was a liability. The vote at Global Wings Alliance was a landslide. She was stripped of her direct authority, demoted to a non-executive board seat with no real power. She had won control of the company for less than a week before being functionally ousted. The final blow came at Aura. The board meeting was a somber, funereal affair. They asked for her resignation as CEO. When she refused, they voted. It was nearly unanimous. She was to be moved to a founder and chief visionary role, a title with no team, no budget, and no power. A golden cage. Her COO, Michael, the man she had spoken to from the airport lounge, was named interim CEO. In the space of 2 weeks, Serafina James had gone from the conqueror at the top of the world to an outcast. She had lost control of the company she was acquiring, and now she had lost the company she had built. She sat alone in her office, the glass walls that once felt like a window to the world now feeling like a fishbowl. She had fired a handful of people to make a point about power and respect, and in return, the world had fired her. The karma wasn't just hard, it was brutally, poetically, and catastrophically complete. The silence that followed her fall was not peaceful. It was a crushing atmospheric pressure that filled every corner of her glass-walled penthouse. For 2 decades, Serafina James's life had been a symphony of controlled chaos, the ceaseless ping of priority emails, the back-to-back cadence of board meetings, the urgent buzz of her phone, connecting her to a global network of power. Now there was only the whisper of the ventilation system and the distant muffled sirens of a city that no longer seemed to care she existed. She was a ghost in her own life. The board of Aura Innovations had been swift and surgically precise. Her access was revoked, her corporate accounts frozen, her nameplates removed. Her COO, Michael, a man she had mentored, promoted, and trusted implicitly, had delivered the final sterile eulogy in a press conference, speaking of a new chapter and realigning with core values, his eyes never quite meeting the camera. The sting of that betrayal was a sharper, more intimate pain than the public humiliation. For the first month, she drifted. Days bled together, marked only by the shifting light across the polished concrete floors. She would stand for hours before the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the ceaseless flow of traffic on the streets below, feeling profoundly disconnected from the world she once commanded. She'd seen news clips of Harrison Croft proudly announcing Oceanic Air's new Customer First initiative, a thinly veiled reference to her downfall. Rage, hot and acidic, would rise in her, followed by a wave of profound emptiness. She had been so certain, so utterly convinced of the righteousness of her stand. She had fought a battle against prejudice, and won only to have the victory itself reframed as her greatest sin. The question haunted her sleepless nights. Was she wrong? Not about the principle. Never the principle. The dismissive look from Gary Phillips, the sneering condescension from Brenda Hoskins. These were not isolated incidents. They were the 1,000 tiny cuts of a systemic bias she had fought her entire life. To have ignored it would have been a betrayal of herself and every other person of color who had been made to feel like they didn't belong. But the method, the how, as David Chen had called it, had her fury, however righteous, blinded her to the consequences. One bleak afternoon, trying to escape the echo chamber of her own thoughts, she opened a secure digital vault containing her personal archives. She scrolled past years of business plans and acquisition proposals until she found what she was looking for, a folder from the early days. There was a photo of her 20 years younger standing in her first office. It wasn't an office so much as a glorified closet with a single window that looked out onto a brick wall. She was smiling, holding up a letter, the first seed funding check from David Chen. She remembered the elation, but she also remembered the dozens of rejections that had preceded it. She recalled the venture capitalist who told her the market for her kind of leadership was limited. The banker who suggested she find a male partner to be the face of the company. She had built her empire as a fortress against that world brick by painful brick. She had believed that amassing overwhelming power was the only way to insulate herself from the prejudice she could never entirely escape. Flight 815 was the ultimate test of that fortress. She had deployed its full arsenal, a nuclear option, to obliterate a single insulting threat, and in the blinding flash of that power, she had managed to blow up her own fortress from within. The irony was so brutal it was almost elegant. It was in that moment of painful clarity that she truly thought about Frank Hoskins in room 302. He was not an abstraction anymore, not a piece of journalistic ammunition used against her. He was a man dying in a hospice bed whose final months of peace had become a bargaining chip in a corporate war he knew nothing about. She had been so focused on the injustice done to her that she had failed to see the much larger, more complex ecosystem of human struggle her actions had disrupted. Her power had been a sledgehammer in what should have been a surgeon's theatre. Driven by an impulse she didn't fully understand, she began to research. Not Aura, not Oceanic Air, but the palliative care facility in New Jersey. She read about their mission, their funding shortfalls, their dedication to providing dignity in death. It was a world away from her own, a world where power wasn't measured in market caps, but in moments of comfort and compassion. She contacted her personal wealth manager and instructed him to set up an anonymous trust. The process was cold and clinical, a series of encrypted emails and digital signatures. She transferred a sum large enough to feel significant enough to be transformative for the facility, enough to, perhaps in some cosmic way, rebalance a scale she had so violently unsettled. It wasn't an apology to Brenda. Her feelings on that were still too complex, a knot of anger and a strange nascent pity. It wasn't an admission of guilt. It was a quiet acknowledgement that her actions had consequences that rippled far beyond the cabin of an airplane, and that she had a responsibility to the ripples too. It was an act of grace aimed not at a person, but at the situation itself. Making the donation didn't bring absolution, but it did break the paralysis. It was the first decision she had made in months that wasn't about fighting or defending or winning. It was about mending. And with that, the idea began to form. She wouldn't fight to get her company back. The throne was poisoned now. The person who had sat on it was a stranger to the woman she now wanted to become. She sold off a massive block of her non-controlling shares in Aura, a move that made headlines for a day and then was forgotten. The capital, however, gave her a new kind of freedom. She called the new venture the Phoenix Foundation. It was a nod to the myth, to the idea of a new life rising from the ashes of a spectacular immolation. Its mission was a direct reflection of her own painful origin story, to fund the unfundable, to mentor the underestimated. She sought out the brilliant, disruptive ideas being overlooked by the venture capital world because the founders didn't fit a certain mold: the black woman with a biotech breakthrough, the immigrant brothers with a revolutionary logistics app, the queer artist building a new digital marketplace. Her life transformed. The sterile penthouse was replaced by bustling, vibrant co-working spaces. The mahogany boardroom table was swapped for cluttered coffee shop tables. Her days were no longer about leveraging power over others, but about channeling it into them. She wasn't a CIO commanding legions. She was a mentor, a guide asking questions instead of giving orders, listening more than she spoke. About a year after the flight, she was in a shared workspace in Detroit, helping a young engineer named Maya refine a pitch for an app that connected food surplus from restaurants to homeless shelters. Her assistant sent her an email with a link to a small New Jersey newspaper. The headline was unassuming: "Local hospice wing, funded by anonymous guardian angel, gives family peace in final months." Serafina clicked. The article detailed the impact of the donation: new equipment, more nursing staff, renovated family rooms. And there, near the end, was a quote from a new volunteer, Brenda Hoskins. She was recently widowed. "The care my Frank received here. It was a blessing in the darkest time of our lives." The quote read, "That gift from a stranger allowed him to pass with such dignity. Working here now, helping other families, it's how I keep his memory alive. It's how I say, thank you." Serafina read the words, and the last of the bitterness in her soul seemed to dissolve. There was no surge of victory, no feeling of vindication. There was only a profound, somber quiet. She saw two women, their lives irrevocably and violently thrown together, who had both lost everything they thought defined them, and in the wreckage had been forced to find a new, more authentic purpose. She closed the laptop, the energetic buzz of the co-working space filling the silence. She had been thrown off a plane, metaphorically and almost literally, and had lost an empire. But in the long, painful fall to earth, she had learned the difference between the power to command and the power to create. And she had finally truly learned how to fly. In the end, Serafina James's story became a stark reminder that in our hyper-connected world, the line between justice and vengeance is dangerously thin. An act of righteous indignation amplified by social media can spiral into a public crucifixion where nuance is the first casualty. Was she right to fire them? Was the public right to condemn her? Or is the truth buried somewhere in the messy, complicated middle? This story teaches us that true power isn't about winning a single battle, but about having the wisdom and grace to navigate the war of perception. Serafina lost her empire, but she found her purpose. Brenda Hoskins, through her own prejudice and pain, found a path to service. It's a tale with no clean winners or losers, only people changed forever by a fateful confrontation over a single first-class seat. What do you think was Serafina's response? Justified? Or was it a tragic abuse of power? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story made you think, please hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a complex tale, and subscribe for more true-life dramas that explore the shades of grey in our world.